After the ritual did not go as planned, Tunde felt heavy with failure. Each breath felt hard beneath the weight of his fear. The other monks sensed a change and moved silently through the monastery, their eyes wide with fear. Quiet whispers filled the corridors as stories of a curse began to circulate. Tunde could feel his brothers watching him closely, their daily suspicion growing. The brotherhood, once united, was now breaking apart. Their faith no longer gave them comfort and felt more fragile than ever. That night, the entities became bolder, their presence firm. Ghostly figures appeared in the cells, flickering in and out of sight. They whispered dark secrets of despair and madness into the monks' minds. Some monks fell to their knees begging for mercy, while others ran through the dark halls, covering their ears to block out the voices. Tunde, hiding in his cell, felt his guilt weigh down on him more than ever, realizing that his horror was his fault. He curled up and held his head as the voices grew louder, mocking him with images of betrayal and suffering. Caught between his shame and the overwhelming fear around him, he felt himself slipping, his faith breaking under the constant pressure of darkness. The following day, Tunde awoke to find the monastery in disarray. Several monks had abandoned their morning prayers, their minds seemingly shattered by the relentless torment they'd endured. Hushed conversations echoed through the halls, whispers of doubt, fear, and suspicion. Some monks spoke of leaving the monastery entirely, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of terror that had enveloped the sanctuary. Tunde watched in silence, guilt gnawing at him as he witnessed the unraveling of the once devout brotherhood. He knew he was running out of time. The darkness he had brought upon them was consuming everything, and soon there would be nothing left to save. That night, the entities unleashed their full fury. Dark figures loomed over sleeping monks, their twisted forms casting grotesque shadows that seeped into the walls, staining them with an unholy blackness. Screams echoed through the monastery as the monks awoke to find themselves paralyzed, unable to move as the entities whispered vile secrets into their ears, filling their hearts with despair and fear. Tunde too was gripped by this nightmare, his body frozen as a shadowy figure hovered inches above him, its eyes empty yet piercing, seeing into the deepest corners of his soul. He felt its icy breath on his face, and his barely whispered voice promised suffering beyond imagination. At that moment, Tunde understood that this was no longer about mere survival. It was a fight for his soul and those of his brothers. His guilt was crushing, but a spark of determination ignited within him. He could no longer be a silent witness to their suffering. By dawn, the monastery was filled with silence and despair. The air felt heavy with fear. The monks moved slowly, their eyes empty and their faith shattered. Tunde could see how the darkness had affected them. Pale faces, trembling hands, and expressions marked by sleepless nights of fear. He could not endure another night of helplessness or watch his brothers suffer because of his mistake. Desperation weighed on him as he confronted the entities, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He hoped that by surrendering, he might free the others. He prepared for the night ahead. Tunde entered the monastery as night fell, holding the tarot deck that had started this nightmare. With a shaking voice, he walked into the chapel and called out to the unseen forces, asking them to take him and free the others. At first he heard only silence, a heavy quiet surrounding him. Then shadows began to form into twisted skeletal figures that encircled him, their empty eyes staring intensely at him. A cold, ancient voice filled the air, mocking his courage. The entities wanted more than a simple sacrifice. They desired every soul in the monastery. Tunde felt helpless, but he did not back down. Instead, he raised the tarot cards, asking for a sign or a way to lift the curse he had caused. The figures laughed, their voices echoing in the chapel, leaving him with a chilling realization. He would have to confront terrors beyond his imagination to save them all. The next day, Tunde felt determined, but fear bothered him with every step. He understood that asking the entities for help was useless. They thrived on despair and would fight back. As he walked through the quiet halls, he felt the heaviness of his choice. He would face the dark forces directly, even if it meant exploring dangerous knowledge. In the old library of the monastery, he began searching for books on exorcisms and ancient rituals, hoping to find a way to break the link between the tarot cards and the evil forces that haunted them. He found dusty volumes filled with strange symbols and warnings that would have scared him before. But Tunde had no doubts. He would do anything to save his brothers. That night, Tunde gathered the tools he had studied and prepared for a risky ritual. He sat in the middle of his cell, surrounded by circles he had made with salt. Each circle was meant to protect him and drive away evil. As he began to chant, the air turned cold and heavy, and shadows crept along the walls drawn to his voice. Suddenly, an agonizing scream broke the silence. A monk in the next cell was losing his mind due to the entities tormenting him. Tunde's focus slipped, and the shadows moved closer, wrapping around his sword circle and mocking him as they sensed his fear. The darkness pressed in, with tendrils of shadow brushing against him, testing the limits of his circle. Tunde felt his courage fade and the weight of his mistakes bear on him, but he pushed himself to keep going. He knew that if he gave up now, no hope would be left for anyone. As Tunde continued the ritual, his voice grew hoarse, each word a struggle against the oppressive force bearing down on him. The shadows twisted and writhed, pressing against the sword circle with an intensity that made his heart race. Just as he thought he could go no further, a glimmer of light appeared, faint but steady at the edge of his vision. Tunde's spirit surged with hope as he focused on the light, willing it to grow stronger, hoping it might banish the darkness surrounding him. The light pulsed, pushing back the shadows, and for a moment he felt a wave of peace wash over him, as if the weight of the entities had momentarily lifted. But the break was brief. The shadows pulled back and attacked again with more force, hitting the salt circle hard enough to shake the floor. The light started to flicker, dimming under their constant attack. Suddenly, Tunde felt a sharp pain in his hand and looked down to see a dark stain spreading on his skin from where he held the tarot deck. It felt like the deck was fighting against him, connecting him to the entities instead of setting him free. The voices of the entities filled his mind, their whispers turning into mocking laughter, teasing him for thinking he could beat them. Tunde gritted his teeth, trying to stay focused. He then realized that breaking this curse would need more than just rituals or words. It would require a sacrifice much more significant than he had ever thought possible. Tunde's hand throbbed with pain the following day, the dark stain spreading up his arm like an infection. He covered it with his robe, hiding the mark from the other monks, but he could feel its cold burn, a reminder of his failed attempts to combat the evil he had unleashed. Desperation twisted within him, and he realized he was running out of time. Whatever this mark was, it seemed to bind him more profoundly to the curse with each passing hour. As he walked through the halls, he could feel the eyes of his brothers on him, their glances filled with suspicion and fear. The once unbreakable trust between them was replaced by an atmosphere thick with dread and doubt. That night, as darkness returned to the monastery, Tunde drew one last card, hoping it would show him a way forward. The card he drew showed a person bound in chains, surrounded by flames, with empty eyes looking up in pain. As he looked at it, the shadows in his cell seemed to close around him, making it hard to breathe. Whispers filled the room, entering his mind, each one carrying knowledge he was never meant to know. He felt a dark clarity settling over him. He had to offer himself to save his brothers and free the monastery from dark forces. This thought was both frightening and liberating. He realized he was the anchor of the curse, and to break it, he must confront the darkness within and accept his fate. That night, Tunde stood alone in the chapel, feeling the weight of his decision. Shadows stretched around him as if they sensed what he was about to do. With shaking hands, he laid out the tarot cards before him, each one a reminder of the dangers he had created. He knelt down, praying for courage instead of salvation. He knew he must offer himself to the darkness to free his brothers from the curse. With a clear mind and no fear, he felt a strong sense of purpose. He slowly drew a final card. It showed a figure in darkness standing at the edge of an abyss. The ground underneath him shifted as if the chapel had become part of the card, pulling him into its twisted vision. Shadows surrounded him, closing in and whispering promises of pain and suffering. Still, he stood firm and did not waver. He felt his soul pulling away from his body as darkness started to take over him. Each breath became shallower and his vision faded, but he focused on his brothers' faces. Their hope for freedom pushed him to keep going. With his last bit of strength, he whispered a prayer for release, giving himself entirely to the shadows. He knew this sacrifice was the only way to break their link to the mortal world. As Tunde gave in, darkness overwhelmed him, bringing a cold and silent emptiness. He felt weightless, like he was floating in a vast void. Images began to swirl around him, and the faces of the monks he had condemned were twisted in fear, their souls close to despair. He experienced their pain as if it were his own, the anguish cutting through him like broken glass. But as he let the darkness take over, he felt a strange calm. He began to understand that his sacrifice broke the curse that held them. This acceptance allowed him to sink deeper, entirely giving in to the dark force that wanted to consume him. In the monastery, a sudden calm fell. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting like a storm had passed. The monks, huddled in their cells, felt an inexplicable warmth spread through the halls, a sense of peace washing over them. One by one, they emerged, their faces filled with cautious hope. But as they searched for Tunde, their relief turned to sorrow. They found the tarot deck on the chapel floor scattered, with no sign of their brother. Only a faint trace of his presence lingered, a warmth that showed he made a sacrifice. The monks knelt in silent respect, knowing Tunde had given himself to save them. Though his body was gone, his spirit stayed, quietly watching over the monastery he had protected at the cost of his soul. In the following days, the monks worked to adjust to the peace in the monastery. The heavy darkness had gone, but a quiet sadness remained, as if the walls were grieving for Tunde. The monks walked softly, feeling both thankful and sorrowful. They shared stories of Tunde's sacrifice. They spent their days in prayer to honor him. As each monk knelt in thought, they sensed his presence, a warm feeling that seemed to watch over them from beyond. Even with the calm, they remembered the terrible events they had faced, each monk marked by the experience in ways words could not express. One evening, the monks prayed for Tunde's soul one last time. As they chanted, a gentle breeze flowed through the chapel, carrying a soothing scent that reminded them of the peace Tunde had worked to restore. The tarot cards, untouched since his passing, began to glow softly. The dark energy within them faded away, leaving only faint traces of the nightmare. The monks took the cards and buried them in the garden, putting them on the sacred soil to ensure no one would find the dark power again. This act brought them closure and recognized Tunde's sacrifice. The darkness was gone, and although they would always bear the scars of their experience, they knew Tunde's spirit would protect the monastery, quietly guarding it against evil.